Hello and welcome to the DME podcast, brought to you by DME, the podcast booking platform. Whether you're a podcaster or an aspiring guest, the DME app is the perfect platform for you to get booked and manage your podcast bookings. I'm your host, Sukh Hayre, the founder of DME, and on this podcast we'll be discussing the latest news and views in tech, the ins and outs of entrepreneurship, and even dipping our toes into the adrenaline-filled world of mixed martial arts. Today's guest is someone I've followed for quite a while. You'll probably recognise her from Spiked, her Question Time debates, and from the Battle of Ideas Festival. Ella Whelan is a columnist and commentator known for her no-nonsense takes on some of the most controversial issues of modern politics. In this conversation, we get into everything from feminism, the culture of safety, to identity politics, trans debates, and the wider impact of social media on how we think about risk, freedom, and even masculinity. We also unpack the recent abortion law discussions in the UK and why the public debate around these issues has become so heated and at times so difficult to have honestly. It's really open, thought-provoking conversation. Whether you agree or disagree, it's definitely one that will make you think. So please welcome Ella Whelan.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you giving up your time. I have listened to you on various platforms over a number of years. As I kind of just said in our pre-recording chat, I have been a podcast fan for many years, and I see you pop up on, I think it's Spiked podcast, which is one of my regular Friday listens. Then I also see you debating quite furiously on Question Time on your various appearances. And I always kind of appreciated you kind of sticking up for yourself and kind of some of the views I kind of share sometimes, not all the time, but that's the whole idea. So it was a pleasure to meet you at the Battle of Ideas Festival recently in Manchester. Yeah, I know. I was like, oh my God, Ella's on the door. So I know you probably had a weird reaction though. He was just kind of thinking that he knows me. But really appreciate you kind of agreeing to come on the podcast. So I thought we could have a quick chat about kind of yourself, your backstory, and some of your writings and some of your work in journalism, and hopefully have a fruitful conversation.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, awesome. So just for our audience who aren't familiar with you, from what I'm aware, you're kind of a London girl with Irish roots, and who's kind of developed into a no-nonsense journalistic voice. Can you just take us through some of your backstory and how you kind of became to be the journalist and author and columnist that you are today?
Well, my parents, Irish parents, grew up in North London. Now live in East London, so I haven't been very adventurous with my travels throughout my life, but I'm okay with that. I think you don't have to be when you're brought up in London. I have that slight sort of prejudice, which is I think it's the best place in the world. But my parents were political. My mother was a great reader, encouraged me to study English literature. When I went to university, it was very much, would always talk to my parents about whatever I was doing, whatever I was reading. So I had a really good sort of upbringing in terms of opening me up to the world of ideas, gave me a bit of a head start. And then at Sussex University, where I studied English literature for a number of years, I did an MA there as well. It was a sort of time where there was quite a lot of politics going on. There was some of it I might look back now and think, what were we up to? But there was some quite serious, protests and movements around cuts to university funding, which sort of it meant I was hanging out with my now husband in sort of social circles where people were talking a lot about politics, and it was from there with some rows about whether or not to ban certain speakers from coming to campus, because it was sort of, this was, when was that university? It was sort of 2010 to 2014, and it was quite a hot period of no platform and all that kind of stuff going on. And it was then that I got interested in Spiked. And at the time, Spiked, the magazine, the online magazine, was running a sort of free speech on campus campaign, going into universities, holding debates and discussions about, in particular, no platform. And I, with them, helped organise one at Sussex University, about no platform, and whether or not it was a good thing for students to be banning people from coming in, sharing their ideas with them, however much it offended them. And so that was the way, that was my opening. I thought, okay, this is brilliant. I love this. I wasn't so much interested in being a writer. It was more I was interested in politics, and because I just thought, I thought it was the most exciting thing ever. And I lost the loads of friends because being at Sussex, many of them thought that Spiked was absolutely abhorrent for suggesting that students should be able to be trusted with, the space to talk about ideas and be challenged. And that was just absolutely unacceptable, because I thought that was brilliant. So I didn't mind losing some of the friends. And yeah, from there, it's just I've been very lucky, to be able to work with Spiked, and then after Spiked to become involved as part of the team at the Academy of Ideas. I was going to the Battle of Ideas Festival for many years before I was actually a working member of the team, as an audience member, as a volunteer, as a sort of hanger on and fan of Claire Fox and everything she did. And so then, my years working in the Battle of Ideas Festival team with the Academy of Ideas, and then, co-convening some of the festivals more recently, has been really, really brilliant. I don't think there's anything, of course I would say this because I'm part of the team, but I really don't think there is anything like what we do out there at the moment. It's quite interesting recently, you see lots of magazines and sort of other organizations starting to do public events, which is brilliant. But we've been doing it when it wasn't, we were doing it when it wasn't a thing. And the way that we do it is different to everybody, because ours is very much a public festival based around, it's like a town hall sort of meeting. It's based around public discussion. So the speakers are sort of a second thought in a way some of the time. So yeah, it's, for me, the journalism, opinion writing, whatever you want to call it, is sort of just my way to be involved in politics. The thing I love most is to talk politics like we are doing right now. So it's any way I can do that is when I'm happy.
Well, obviously you've obviously I think much of your writing is focused on women's issues, and I think you a number of years ago kind of authored the book What Women Want, and kind of, I think you took a different stance when it came to writing about women's issues, and kind of called out the doubling down on victimhood and safetyism. Can you just explain that concept for us, please?
Yes, so that book, which is really just an overblown pamphlet, the small book I wrote, the full title was What Women Want: Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. And so obviously it puts a lot of people off and you still get a lot of gasps when they read it out on a BBC panel discussion that I'm taking part in. But what I wanted to do was to challenge the idea that contemporary modern feminism was about women's freedom, because as I see it, it isn't about freedom. It's about protection and safetyism and vulnerability. And in the book, I finished by saying we really need to rekindle a new women's liberation movement, kind of women's politics that's based around making women free rather than making women feel safe. So what do I mean by contemporary feminism makes women feel safe rather than free? Well, a lot of the legislation that's suggested to combat very serious things like violence against women and girls is all centered around the idea that the only way to better women's life is to bring in more law, to bring in more police protection, whether that's through speech protections or through police escorts around certain, the idea of sort of police looking over your shoulder with anti-harassment laws on the street, or things like regulations in the workplace to stop men and women having free open relationships as adults. But the idea is that everything needs to have some layer of sort of bubble wrap around it, that's what women need to women will be happy if they feel safe. And actually my argument is that if you are focused on safety and protection, then, the reality is you cannot be free, because freedom contains and necessitates risk and danger and the possibility for things to go wrong. And, I've had the great honor and pleasure of interviewing Camille Paglia when I was working with Spiked a number of years ago, who's a brilliant free-thinking American feminist, among many other things, an academic and thinker. And she's she's famous for articulating what it's not really new what I wrote about at all, but she articulated it back when she was campaigning to end sort of in loco parentis rules in universities, where women in university dorms were forced to be protected, which meant be under curfew. And she said, we demand the right to risk rape, along those lines, she said. And that's what I mean, the fact that if you're free, you can do anything. And that means that anything can also happen to you, which is not a small consideration, but more importantly, it means you can do anything. And I think we've sort of forgotten or neglected that side of women's politics, that side of feminism, the idea that we can do anything, the sort of powerful side. I'm more and more day by day starting to sort of fall back in love with the kind of 90s Spice Girls feminism. I mean, not because of all the sort of girl boss stuff is naff, and I don't like the sort of corporate side of it, but just more, there was just a kind of kick-ass element to it that I think we need to, and a confidence that I think we need to sort of find a way of instilling in young women today, because I'm very depressed a lot of the time at how scared and unsafe so many young women feel at a time when that isn't a sensible way to feel, because the risks and the dangers that women face, that they do exist, but that not at the level that I think we talk about them. At the moment, sort of young women are told that they pretty much from the minute they leave their house to the minute they get back home again are under constant threat from one thing or another. And I think that does a lot to damage women's sense of self-empowerment.
Yeah, so I think just as you were kind of describing the safetyism culture there, it kind of just reminded me that it kind of defeats the purpose of feminism. Because if you do want women empowerment, if you're asking women to be safe or to feel safe, they'd actually be outsourcing that safety to either the state and ultimately to men. Because at the end of the day, let's be honest, the biological reality is, it is what it is, right? The strongest woman in the world isn't going to overpower the average man, generally speaking. Obviously, always the exceptions, but and I'm just kind of thinking back to your moments of 90s nostalgia. I probably remember the 90s a bit better than you do, given our age differences. But yeah, you're right. I mean, in the 90s, I remember a lot of the culture was around going to Ibiza, partying, and they had all these stories of obviously girls going out and partying. Obviously, it attracted all the guys who were going out with them. But then women were a lot more different to the 80s, were very openly talking on TV about going out, getting drunk in groups and snogging loads of lads and whatever that may be. But it was very much a freeing, a more freeing culture for women, I guess. Are we seeing kind of was a movement that you were kind of battling against in terms of safety? Is that a rebound, do you think, of that culture a little bit in terms of women needed to be protected from themselves? Maybe that a chauvinistic attitude, if that was what it was. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that the sort of ladette phenomenon really, really got up the nose of a lot of sort of middle class feminists. I think it just really disgusted them, actually, that there were, because it was, the whole kind of like a party Ibiza scene that you're describing was, not completely, but it was sort of like you could identify it as a sort of working class thing. Of like, having a good time, not caring, the sort of beer guzzling, all the rest of that. And I think there was just there's a really sort of snobby reaction to it by a lot of middle class feminists who just thought, yuck, and they thought it's the same, there's their same reaction to my favorite example that I always come back to is the sort of Harriet Harman, Labour MP, Grandee, famous, British feminist, meant to be sort of like the mother of all these things. Huge campaigner against Page 3, basically ran the No to Page 3 campaign, which successfully took images of women's naked top halves, naked breasts out of red top papers, and so disgusted by that, which was predominantly, most of them sort of normal working class girls getting, I don't know, £300 for a picture, topless pictures of themselves, said that was the height of misogyny. And then a few years ago was on breakfast television talking about how empowering Kim Kardashian was for posing with her ass out, with her butt out, with a champagne pouring out, everybody knows the famous picture, that was inspirational to women. And you're just like, oh my God, I couldn't have written a parody of this better. This is so good, for it just perfectly, just a perfect example of just how snotty so much of middle class feminism is. Whether it's the people who campaigned against the darts girls, or the walk on girls who wear glamorous outfits to the darts or whatever it is, to Formula One, things like that. And so on the one hand, I think there's just snobbiness to it. On the other hand, I would hate for anyone to think that I was being dismissive about the real things that women still continue to, the women's history and the real things that we continue to face. So obviously the history of feminism is a response to very real oppression of women. If you want to go back to our grandmothers' times, which, in living history, women did not enjoy the same rights and freedoms as men. So this is not a small thing. There are still some slight hangovers from that. I mean, institutionally, there isn't any. In the law, there isn't any. We're free and equal under the law in the workplace. All of these things, women have the opportunities that men have. So there's no institutional oppression anymore, or discrimination. But there are still sexists and sexisms out there. And it is still the case that, as you rightly pointed out, the physical differences between men and women mean that men can be threatening to women, and it's not a small thing. I wouldn't ever try to dismiss that. I think, though, what's happened, which is sort of interesting and disturbing, is that as the threats against women decrease, as they have done from my granny's time to my mum's time to now my experience as a teenager in the 2000s, and in the 90s, 2000s, and now, is that sexism is now very obviously wrong, whereas for our mothers and grandmothers it was the norm. It's now completely abnormal. It's frowned upon. It's very much called out. Anybody who does it knows that they're doing something wrong. And yet, despite the fact that all of this, life has gotten easier for women, we've ramped up the sort of fear levels. So you now hear young women talking about how they want to carry around rape alarms and pepper spray, and they when they go out running, they're sort of completely head to toe in high vis, and just utterly terrified. And so I think that there's something gone on in terms of a sort of just a break with reality, that it's now no longer okay to say women are doing really well, men are doing pretty good as well. They've stopped doing all this bad stuff that they used to do. So what now? We're resistant to have a sort of reassessment of what it is that women actually want. I think we're just sort of still want to. It's not done to say, basically, can we dial down the sort of moral panic here? You're just horrible if you say that, or you're victim blaming, or you're whatever. But I actually think that it's really, really, really important that we dial down the fear factor, because it's stopping women from really tackling any of the real issues that we're facing. There are real issues in terms of problems around childcare provision, problems around abortion rights, even still inequalities, informal inequalities, in your family life. I've mum of two small kids, and after you have children, you start to realize that there are different expectations for men and women, and some of them aren't fair. And so these things, there are still battles that need to be fought and talked about and discussed, but we can't do that if we're sort of in this, living in this sort of sea of panic and fear the whole time, which is completely unnecessary.
See, I think you're saying that, and I'm kind of agreeing with you half the time, and then disagreeing with you the other half of the time. So I think you're right. I think there is we are fed messages of panic and fear about all things, not just women's safety, and those, as social media has become more and more pervasive over the last 20 years or so, you do get those. You always get the negative horror stories amplified at you, and they're the ones that stick in your brain. I mean, father of 2 teenage or almost teenage daughters myself, so you have those fears, and then it's like, yeah, I can recognize that a lot of those, it's overhyped, and generally speaking most people are fine. I mean, the attitudes of men, and even my son, who's kind of sits in the middle of the daughters, but he wouldn't imagine saying or thinking the things about girls that we would do when we were kids. And it was obviously innocent and stupid childishness and immaturity. But his generation is very different to what we were at that same age. But then the other half of me is like, I'm a dad to 2 girls, right? I see it as my job to protect them, right, and
of course, yeah,
shelter them from the big wide world. But then I thought, yeah, but the boys aren't different. But my youngest daughter plays lots of football, etc., and she plays with boys and with girls. But she's been told by boys on the football pitch, get back in the kitchen, what are you doing on the football pitch? Which is like, I thought it was quite funny, to be when my daughter complained about him. I was like, it's weird that a 13 or 12 or 13-year-old would come out with that statement, because it seems a very dated statement. Maybe because I love cooking as well, so I'm always in the kitchen. But
no, but it's interesting though, because I think there has been a sort of I find the Andrew Tate phenomenon, and people who don't know him, he's this horrible guy who's become a bit of a sort of cultural, I don't know, is icon the wrong word? He's sort of like, everybody wants to talk about Andrew Tate because he uses social media and YouTube and all the rest of it to talk to young boys or talk to men about how to be proper men, and his views are genuinely misogynistic, and they're, you know, ridiculous, and they're very, very kind of boringly old-fashioned in a way, sort of make me a sandwich kind of style of sexism. But I think that there's been a sort of, the whole sort of, I'm going to use the word panic again, the whole sort of panic around incels and the manosphere, as it's called now, and Louis Theroux's just done a documentary on it, and Andrew Tate, and all this sort of like malevolent toxic masculinity. I really genuinely just am not convinced that it was an authentic problem. I think what's happened is that we're sort of conjuring this problem up, and there's this idea that sort of young boys are, well, there's very solidified idea that young boys are animals, and unless they are tamed by, you know, specific relationship advice in sex education classes at school and consent classes at universities, and, you know, being forced to watch adolescents at school and the rest of it, that unless we kind of like rein in their disgusting, depraved, animalistic tendencies, they'll all turn out to be abusers and you know, and terrible people. And one, that's not true. Two, it will become true for a section of boys if you keep telling them that they're awful, and the only person that tells them that they're good is Andrew Tate. I mean, it's like you can just see why some young men are thinking, okay, this guy, they're not stupid, they think, okay, this guy's saying a lot of ridiculous stuff, but I mean, at least he knows what a man is. And, you know, there's that sort of sense that I think we've really just completely evacuated the field of having a conversation with boys about proper role models, about masculinity, about what men should be like, because we've completely lost confidence in it, because we've spent 20 years trashing it. So, like, you know, sometimes for good reason. There is toxic masculinity, and you know, we all know it when we see it. But instead of saying you're a bit of no, I don't like you, you're horrible when you do that, we've just said throw the whole thing out, say there can be no masculinity anymore. So I'm not surprised that then there are some boys now coming out with some of this ridiculous stuff, but it's sort of I think it's like performative. Yeah, and it's not real. And also I think that, you know, you'll know with 2 teenage girls, I remember myself, there is nothing more frightening than a teenage girl. Nothing. I've never come across a more terrifying prospect than, you know, they've got tongues like whips. They are, they are so much more psychologically, emotionally advanced than boys. They are, particularly in groups. So just, there's like, everybody seems to think that girls are always just cowering in the toilets crying about what someone said to them. From my experience working in schools and being a teenage girl not crazy long ago, it's the opposite. They're the hardiest bunch, actually.
Yeah, and my 16-year-old will love arguing with me for the sake of argument, and I'm pretty decent when it comes to arguing. But even on, she stumps me sometimes. I'm like, damn it, should never have sent you to grammar school. You regret it quite often. No, but yeah, I think feminism, the feminist narrative has probably got a little bit to play. I think the Andrew Manosphere type reaction is a counter reaction to the last 10, 15 years, the kind of the feminist voice more than anything. Maybe it's conscious. I think it's probably a natural rebalance to the centre. So you've had the two extremes on the end, but I think obviously with the women debate over the last few years, it's always been being able to define what actually a woman is, because it's been taken to the absurd extreme, hasn't it, with the trans rights movements, etc. How do you kind of look back on that? Because it seems to be kind of dissipating a little bit, and the common sense seems to be prevailing. I know the Olympics have kind of recently banned trans athletes or transgender athletes from women's sports or something like that. So this does seem to be kind of rebalancing a little bit over the last 12 to 18 months. Is that your impression as well?
Yes and no. So yes, there have been some, the fact that you have big institutions dropping Stonewall, moves like the transgender athletes no longer being allowed at the Olympics. And, even I was listening to Radio 4 today, at the PM program, and they were interviewing an athlete, 5-time Olympic winner, woman, who was saying, it's not fair that trans women can compete, i.e. men can compete in women's sports. It's not fair. You can't have men in women's sports. You just never have heard an interview like that. You really wouldn't have for years and years and years. So even the fact that view is being aired on Radio 4 now is like quite a big moment. And I think that's down to things like, the wins that For Women Scotland had with the Supreme Court ruling, a lot of the work that the whistleblowers did at the Tavistock to get that place shut down, and bring to light what was happening with the sort of negligence, medical and psychological negligence, and poor care for kids who are coming forward with gender dysphoria and being put on pills at the Tavistock. So there's been moments there's been victories that have, I think, allowed space for people to say, okay, can we now say that we think this is nuts? And so there's a bit of breathing room now. But it's definitely not over. I mean, the thing is, it's such a strange thing, the trans phenomenon, because, what you sort of use the idea of there being a sort of rebalancing, a bit like what we were talking about, the feminism and the Andrew Tate thing. But it's just such a weird, to go from the whole of human history thinking one thing, which is that men are men and women are women, generally speaking. And of course, I think it's a good thing that society in recent years has become much more liberal to difference. And that means, like, you don't have to secretly live a life, if you like wearing high heels and a dress, you can. And most people are like okay with that, so I think, liberal in terms of what people wear and look like is fine. But then what happened was, suddenly you were told that up was down and left was right, and that it was no longer that you had to be okay with women, no longer had to be okay with men pretending to be women. You had to believe that men could become women. And so I'm not really sure where the rebalancing is from that. It's just it has to sort of, you kind of feel like you just have to rewind back time and go back to the normality that was before, when this wasn't a thing. Of course, we can't do that. And actually, I think that the way I understand the sort of where the trans movement moment has come from, has been quite a long trajectory of sort of identity politics, going back, from feminist politics, the gay rights movement, anti-racism politics. a lot of the sort of political movements of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then as they moved in to the 21st century, were increasingly focused on the idea that yourself and what you thought about yourself and your own identity was the most important thing. So, if you think back to the sort of the sort of phrases that people would use, like speaking as a white woman, or speaking as a black man, or speaking as a gay, disabled, blah, blah, whatever it was, the whole sort of intersectionality thing that was, became so typical of all these different, gay rights, feminist, anti-racist politics. What that's saying is, it's not what you say in the world, what you do in the world, what you achieve, whatever it is that matters. It's who you are, what you identify as. And so if you recognize all of that, it's then sort of logical that it ends in the trans movement of saying, I am a woman, I feel like a woman, therefore I am a woman. So I think probably until we have a real sort of reckoning with where it's come from, with the problem of identity politics, not just the problem with this trans thing, but the whole problem with identity politics, it's not going to go away. And certainly there are many, many people who are not convinced that it's wrong to, for example, ban trans girls from the Girl Guides, which is another thing that's happened recently. But that's sort of the most horrible, evil thing you can do, and completely, terribly discriminatory to not allow boys to come into girls' dorm rooms. I mean, it's like, to me, it's just utterly ludicrous. But anyways, there's people who are convinced that that's still an okay thing to do. So I think there's more battles to be fought, and I think probably more sort of subtle battles. It's not going to necessarily be a case of sort of legal, is that we just win all the legal fights and it's over. There has to be a real cultural shift, and so I think it's going to be on the agenda for a good while yet, and the potential also for it to pop up in other forms until we really get to grips with the idea that you really shouldn't put a lot of stock next to, and you shouldn't care so much about yourself being so narcissistic and being so sort of inward looking, particularly for young people. Until we get to grips with that problem, it's not going to go away. I've got my eye on the sort of at the kind of the politics of mental health, which has been for a long time coming, but I think really it has a lot to do with the trans movement, and it's just going crazy with young people at the moment. I think the whole sort of the pandering to how you feel and how you believe you feel and all this kind of thing is, I think, going to lead to some really bad places for young people. So I'm unhappy, but I'm still a bit pessimistic, probably.
I think harking back to your earlier point about it not just being an identity struggle, but I think you're right. I suspect I've had this thought for a while, is that a lot of identity issues are really class issues, just being masquerading as feminist issues, masculine issues, transgender issues, etc. Because I'm not sure about you, maybe this is my own biases and prejudices creeping in, but I don't see many boys and girls come off the council estate wanting to be women. Poppy's not really turning into Paul. I think it's a problem of the middle classes and the privileges of having a bit too much free time on your hand, and you're not really struggling that much. If that's your major concern, and you know, I'm a woman today, and I want to start using the girls' changing rooms or whatever it may be, and I want inclusion in girls' spaces, I think your life isn't hard enough. I think you've got to challenge yourself. But stepping into kind of the cultural and politics debate, I think the famous Andrew Breitbart saying was that politics is downstream from culture. And I actually think it's the other way around. I think culture is downstream from politics these days, because politics has seemed to become like an international sport, really. Everyone's got a team and everyone's cheering on their respective sides. I think under the recent Labour government, we've seen a lot of policies being introduced in favour of women, for example. I think, was it Stella Creasy who kind of introduced a bill about, was it bringing children to work or something like that? If I recall, yeah. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. And we've also had the recent abortion rights bill, I think it is. Now, I was prepared to have an argument with you on this because I did see some of your tweets coming out in defense of the policy, and my natural instinct was, oh my God. But then I kind of read up a little bit about it, and I was like, oh, it's not quite as what the headline said. Could you just kind of give us a quick précis of what the most recent bill that is, I think it's in the process of passing, is it? It's bouncing back between the House of Parliament and the House of Lords?
Yeah, so it's I think it's a bit of legislation that's been much misinterpreted. So it's an amendment to so for people who don't know, the current law is that you can have an abortion up to 24 weeks. After that, late term, as they're called, abortions are available under specific conditions. So, for example, if you find out that you've got a baby with Down syndrome, something like that, there is the option to have a late term abortion. But it's small, kind of narrow things that will allow you to have that procedure. There have been a handful of cases, and I mean really a handful of cases, of women who have had illegal late-term abortions. So that's abortions that don't fall under that category of special special
circumstances.
Yeah. And for example, there's been a case or two of women taking telemedical abortion pills. So that's the pills by post, which was introduced during COVID, which is pills you can take that's intended for early abortions. Pills that were for many years and still given out in clinics, but through obviously during COVID, when women weren't allowed to go to access a clinic, they were this thing was created, pills by post, so they were posted to you and you could take them at home. And there's been for example, one high profile case of a woman who took those pills too late, and that ended up causing some very serious complications, and she it was an illegal, technically an illegal late-term abortion. So that's that's background. This amendment has come in to suggest that not to change the legality of anything, but to say that women who have late-term abortions that are not under those special circumstances will not face jail time. So it's all it's doing, if you want, some people say, well, that's a very big thing, and you might think that. From my point of view, all it's doing is saying that women won't go to jail for having late-term abortions. Why do I think that's a good thing? Number one, there have been lots of cases of women who've had miscarriages who have been under criminal investigation, and I think that's horrific when they've done absolutely nothing. Number two, I would argue that I don't think I don't think there's anything criminal in trying to access a abortion at any stage. And three, I don't think there's any public appetite to send women to jail for late-term abortions. Now, the thing I think is interesting is that, would I have created this piece of legislation? No, I would be much more in favour for having a public discussion about full decriminalisation, which means just take abortion out of criminal law, repeal whatever you need to repeal from the Offences Against the People Act, scrap the 67 Act and just say abortion is no longer a criminal thing. It's just regulated like other healthcare procedures, properly, safely, like, part of women's healthcare. I think we should have a big public discussion about that, because it would be a big move. I think there's, lots of people are, in this country, we're generally quite liberal on abortion, but you would have to, have a discussion about what that would mean. It would mean that people were allowed to have late-term abortions and not just for special circumstances. And I would be very excited to argue about why I think that's a good thing for women's freedom, and why I, sitting here today, am not as free as you. So because I can't define my future, because I have this law which, if I get pregnant, forces me to become a mother, and maybe I wouldn't want to be. So would I have written this legislation? Would I have, if I was an MP, would I have done it? Probably not. I would have gone through a different route. But I think what's really interesting, what I'm more interested in, has been the reaction to it. So the reaction, mainly, I think, has revealed a very big problem with the way in which the way in which women's autonomy and women's moral capabilities are viewed, because the anti-abortion, pro-life side, whatever you want to call it, one, they took to social media and said, this is just meaning that women now can kill their babies 5 minutes before they're born, and I think that's just such a twisting of reality of what actually happens when women have late-term abortions. And I think if you want to have a proper, sensible adult debate about the rights and wrongs of abortion, you should deal with reality rather than dealing in fantasy, and having some kind of compassion for what happens when a woman decides to have a late-term abortion, the physicality of what that is, and not so no woman on earth wants to have a late-term abortion. It's a very, very grueling thing physically and emotionally to go through. But two, there was just sort of this absolute denial that women could make moral decisions about their futures. There's just such a characterized in all the interventions that I got on social media, because I was obviously I'm pro-choice. I'm as early as possible, as late as necessary, kind of pro-choicer. I'm an absolutist, and the responses I got weren't really engaging with that. It was more just a sort of, if you give women this freedom, they will be disgusting with it. It will be willy-nilly, and it will be, there'll be babies dying all over the place. And one that's just never been true in terms of the extension of contraception or abortion has never in any country or anywhere ended in a massive uptick in late-term abortions. But two, it's just kind of, I'm just really disappointed in how nasty people have been about women. It just seems to me a really misanthropic, nasty view of what women are capable of, what they want, how they feel, how they act. And so it's made me think we really the pro-choice side need to stop being so complacent and stop being so sort of ridiculous in their own way of just shouting people down. And we have to think about, what is it that we really want to argue for here? What I want to argue for is women's freedom, and how do we articulate that in terms of a discussion about abortion? And I don't foresee that I'm ever going to convince people who are religious or people who have a particular view about babies and fetuses. That's fine. But I want to argue, I'm not trying to change people's faith, but what I want to argue about is, in a society that values and seeks to defend women's freedom, how can this anomaly, which is women's bodily autonomy being controlled by the state, still exist? So my take from all of it is that we need to have more debates about it, like proper debates about it, and it needs to stop just being this social media shouting match. And so I'm lobbying for, at the next Battle of Ideas Festival in October, for there to be a big discussion on abortion, because I think both sides feel sort of like the other side isn't getting them, and that's probably true.
Well, I'd love to debate you on it, but I'm probably not skilled enough or knowledgeable enough, so I'll keep my mouth shut. Okay, so I'm just conscious of time a little bit. I know it's getting quite late, and I'm tired.
Sorry, no, I do go on. You've got to cut me off.
No, absolutely not. You're a perfect podcast guest. I don't have to do any talking. It's perfect. So, I just wanted to cut a couple of last points. What's an important topic do you think that society avoids discussing honestly at this current time, even with all the various public debating clubs and that we have? I still think, in my own impression, that there are certain topics that we don't like talking about, whether that's kind of Israel and Palestine and global conflicts, whether it's the immigration debate. I think it is, in this government, there's always a line that I think people will kind of pull themselves back on and go, they won't say exactly what they think. Do you kind of get that same impression, or do you think there's other topics that we should be talking more about in society that we don't actually?
I think that there's, of the main one that comes to mind is immigration, because it has for such a long time been censored, and there's been no discussion about it. I myself am, I still think I'm pretty liberal on my gut instinct and my sort of my feelings on immigration, my thoughts on immigration are that I want it to be liberal. And so I'm glad there's opened up this sort of greater space for discussion about immigration, because then you can, rather than it just being a sort of total open borders, ridiculous sort of, you're a racist if you say anything, versus, I don't know, your caricature or your Tommy Robinson type or something like that. And that's not where most people are at. Most people are at somewhere along, if not the middle, there's somewhere a mix of those two. The sort of hard line, for such a long time, the hard line view on either side has come to define it. And so I'm glad now that there's some space to discuss it. But I just want to sort of out myself as like a London bubbler, because when we came to Manchester, Battle of Ideas Festival came to Manchester, and we've done we've got salons and everything. We do discussions all over the country and all over the world, actually. But it was just great to have a day in Manchester, because you realise how different audiences are in London and Manchester. Because when we came to Manchester, we had this discussion about, I chaired a discussion about, what was it? It's like about integration and, the idea of what is British values and all that. And just no one at all minced their words. And that doesn't mean that everybody was sort of like sounding off, but it was just, there was no nervousness in the room. People just said what they thought. And it was so, I don't want to patronize, but it was so freeing, sitting there thinking, oh, thank God, no, we're not pussyfooting around anything. This is just great. We're getting straight to it. And I think it was a good reality check for me, because I think a lot of the time I think that the sort of Westminster nervousness, please don't say anything, or like middle class North London sort of dinner party etiquette is how everybody acts. And of course that's not. That there are still, despite the fact that pubs are closing all over the place, there are still people who go and see their friends and talk politics. And Brexit was a brilliant reminder of that. This is people are engaged, sort of whether or not you like reform, that sort of a political kind of reawakening for people in the reform movement is also an expression of that. There are people out there who want to talk about things. And people aren't just sitting at home and shouting at the television anymore. People do weird things in elections. Gorton and Denton by-election being, another kind of, there's lots of depressing elements to it in terms of how balkanised it was. On the other hand, people are volatile. People change their minds, and all of that, I think, is good. It means that there's more discussion, and we've been through 20 years of sort of apathy, censorship, and now things are happening. A lot of it's not good, but things are happening and people are talking. And so actually, whether it's issues about immigration, issues about trans, issues about net zero, you couldn't say anything about net zero until quite recently. And it's probably because, the Ukraine war and now war in Iran, everybody's feeling. My husband is telling me, don't. He's a tree surgeon, and sometimes I work with him, and he keeps telling me to turn the chipper off when I work with him, because he's terrified about diesel. These things make people think again about something like net zero. But I think there is more space, but we've just got to keep pushing. You keep pushing. You can never have too much discussion. Keep pushing for more free speech, because the world is a better place when we can talk about it.
Yeah. Absolutely agree. Okay, Ella, if our audience wanted to kind of follow more of your work and kind of your thoughts and your appearances on various media channels, where's the best place to follow you?
Oh, well, like every loudmouth journalist, broadcaster, I'm on Twitter, X, which is probably the easiest place. But, check out Spiked, check out the Academy of Ideas, buy tickets for the Battle of Ideas Festival, which is happening in London in October. But we will be coming back up north next year, and we've got lots of different debates and salons and discussions. Just have a look at our website, follow our Substack, and I do a lot of writing there. So yeah, get in touch with the Academy of Ideas.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to all that in the episode description. But Ella Whelan, thank you for appearing on the DME podcast.
Thanks for having me.